Afternoon, Ms. Joannidis. Mr. McIntosh?
Thank you, my lord. So, what I'd like to move on to now is the topic of the water safety group. And in your statement, the reason I'm asking this is in your statement on question 27, you explained that you don't recall the content of a DMA Canyon report.
Yes.
And I wonder if we could look at that question. So that's on page 458 of the statement bundle. The question we asked you was, when were you first made aware of the DMA Canyon reports? How did this come about? So I wonder if I can press you. When did you first become aware of the content of a DMA Canyon report about the hospital?
I can't remember.
You can't remember?
I don't know.
The reason I ask that is because you served on the water safety groups as long as back as 2012.
Shame.
I wonder if we can go to bundle 11. Now, I think it's fair to say we need to look at the term of reference of the water safety group, which is on page 5. So we see that it reports to the Board Infection Control Committee, and there are various people recorded as being present, one of whom is the lead infection control nurse. I'm assuming that's why you were there.
Yes.
Yes. And if we look at the terms of reference, within that is developing the water safety plan. You see that? Third one down?
Yes.
And effective planning and management of any clinical instance where the water supply is implicated.
Yes.
Yeah. And the first one is to fulfill the remit of the Board Water Safety Group as per SHTMO 401. Are you aware of what SHTMO 401 Part B says about the Water Safety Group?
I couldn't tell you what it says today.
But would you have known about it at the time?
Water safety, yeah. I would be aware of the document.
Right, okay. The reason I ask is because if we go to page 43 of this bundle, we come to a meeting of the Water Safety Group on the 4th of August 2015, in which you are recorded as being present in rather a lightly attended meeting.
Yes.
Despite the reference in the term of reference that deputies should attend, you are there with Jim McFadden, Sector Estates Manager for Clyde, Alan Gallagher, General Estates Manager for Estates, John Green, Health and Safety Service Manager, Facilities and Partnerships, and Billy Hunter, the Chair, who's General Manager for Facilities South and Clyde Sector. And the reason what I want to jump to is on the next page, item 5. I have no expectation that you will remember this necessarily, but I'm intrigued to see what it might mean. Alan Gallagher noted that the policy had been endorsed by BICC, so that'd be Board Infection Control Committee. So would BICC be Board Infection Control Committee?
Board infection, yes.
Yes. Due to be reviewed in May 2016, site-specific written schemes are required to be produced by the end of October 2015. So when you say site, would Queen Elizabeth University Hospital have been a site in this context?
Yes.
Yes. And can you explain what a written scheme is?
No.
No. It then says, DMA will base a written scheme on the Southern General Hospital retained site based on SHTMO 301 Part G, which will be shared with AE for input and bring to this group for endorsement, draft to be discussed at the next meeting prior to rollout. So the question I wanted to ask, well, the next sentence is, JMF noted the template has been produced for Queen Elizabeth. The written scheme will identify the control issues. Does it seem from this minute that there was a discussion of the need for a written scheme for the new hospital at this meeting in August 2015?
So there was a written scheme for all parts of the health board.
Well, in fact, we've had evidence there wasn't a written scheme at this point.
I was just going to say I wouldn't know if there was one,
No,
but
so
there should have been.
Well, indeed, it's not so much whether there was or wasn't one, but would you agree that this minute looks like it's describing the discussion of whether there should be one?
It looks as if it is, yes.
And it looks like it's to do so based on a template from DMA Canyon.
Yes.
Yes. Now, the first question, which I think I'm going to know the answer to this, but I should ask it for completeness. At this point, August 15, was the fact that the new hospital had failed its L8 risk assessment known to the water safety group?
I can't give detail, but that triggers, yes, that Legionella was discussed.
Could it have been discussed in the context of the retained estate?
I couldn't differentiate, sorry.
Because the thing that's concerning me is when I read through all the minutes for the water safety group, it doesn't appear that it has regularly reported to it that individual sites have failed assessments.
Right.
So that isn't in there. But so I'm not going to assume anything, but I'm wondering if you can recollect whether at that point you might have heard of a Legionella risk assessment failing for the site.
So I remember Legionella was discussed, but I can't remember detail.
Do you think it might have been discussed back in 15 or 16?
It certainly would have been. The board water safety group discussed all sector. They got feed in from all sector water safety groups, and those would have been brought to the board water safety group and any highlight issues mentioned.
Because conscious this is a long time ago, you see at item 8, there is a discussion that Mr. Gallagher met with Craig Williams and John Hood to discuss Legionella sampling, which of course is not the same as a risk assessment.
Yeah.
And then item 9, risk assessment water safety. And there's a discussion there of a risk. I don't know what that is. Do you know what a risk assessment water safety July 2015 is?
So that specific risk assessment, and it's badly minuted. So I take you back to why I'm on the board water safety
Yes,
group.
of course.
After I became the nurse consultant, Tom Walsh approached me and said, "Can you sit on the board water safety group in a clinical presence?" And it was to make sure that the board water safety policy incorporated the document, the minimising risk from Pseudomonas.
Which was new at that point.
I can't remember the date,
Yes.
but I think it was.
Yeah.
So I was asked to incorporate some wording into the board water safety. So my reason for being on the board water safety group, I was told, was only to do with Pseudomonas and the clinical aspects of Pseudomonas, because I questioned why I would be on the board water safety group when I have no expertise.
Well, indeed, that was going to be a question.
I have no expertise. So I got clear instruction from Tom Walsh, and that's when I agreed to go on to the board water safety group. So the risk assessment at number 9 is the risk assessment that I undertook with Craig Williams and John Green, Health and Safety Officer, around Pseudomonas.
Because the final item in AOCB on that page is a discussion of a requirement to have risk assessments as and when required, which is a change to the guidance. Do you recollect there was any discussion about when individual hospitals had their risk assessments done?
I don't recollect, and my risk assessment would cover the whole of GGC.
So your risk assessment was a general risk assessment?
It was a general risk assessment undertaken by myself and John Green and ICD at the time, and it linked to the Pseudomonas guidance only. Yeah.
And then on the top of page 45, the next page, there's a discussion about written schemes. Do you recollect whether there was a pan-Glasgow approach to written schemes?
can't say. I can't remember.
Right, what I want
There
to
would
do,
have been, though, because the original board water safety policy was called Board Water Safety Policy and Written Scheme. So there would have been a board written scheme attached to the policy
right,
when I first started the water safety group.
and what I wanted to understand, and you may not be able to help me with this, is do you remember whether at this point in this 2015, the ward safety group was discussing the water system in the new hospital and what state it was in?
I don't remember that.
One of the concerns that I suppose one could have about water safety groups is that if they're focused on policies and the presence of policies, the existence of policies, the maintenance of policies, they're not very good at responding to events. And how would you respond to the suggestion that the board water safety group or the health board wasn't very reactive? It was just focused on ticking off requirements that are in SHFN 0401.
I think it was reactive to certain, because there was a lot of discussion about results and schemes and a lot of operational issues discussed, a lot of technical discussion that I found hard to follow, but was comfortable that I wasn't there for that reason.
So one thing that's an interesting contrast is that we can take this off the screen, is that we have a water safety group of which you are present to just bring your particular perspective to around Pseudomonas, and it's reaching decisions. And then we have incident management teams where everybody is involved in the decision and everyone seems to have an opinion on every aspect of it. Is that a fair description of the difference? That one is a series of people who are specialists and the other is a consensus body where everyone has their say?
The board water safety group was bringing together all the work and minutes from the individual sector water safety groups. So perhaps it was because there were sector and on-site water safety groups with local working, and they would be populated by people, but then those minutes would be brought.
So it was more a collection point for minutes than a place for making decisions about sites?
I think problems were brought to the board water safety group and they were made aware, but then they were also made aware of what actions had been taken or would be taken with regard.
But I'm just worried that how could you participate in the meeting as a full member if you only were there to represent a particular specialism?
I think it was made very clear to me, and I made it clear to Tom Walsh, that I wouldn't be there for anything other than what he asked, and that was the Pseudomonas. And that in itself required a lot of liaison with clinical staff, and particularly around flushing. That had an impact on Legionella, obviously, but and we used those risk assessment documents if we had a patient with a Pseudomonas.
How does a water safety group make decisions if some of its members are only there for particular subtopics because that's the limits of their experience?
I would be aware not to give an opinion out with my scope of practice.
And you think that's an important principle?
I think it's an important part that I don't give advice where I'm not qualified to give that advice and where it's not my remit to give that advice.
That's helpful. What I think we'll do is move on. In your statement on later on in At this point, I'll hopefully not written the paragraph down so I will find it. You have said question 23, page 455. You were asked, do you consider there to have been a risk of infection from the water supply? And if so, explain why. And you've given your answer, which was yes. And then the disinfection of the water supply with chlorine dioxide and use of point-of-use filters on all water outlets reduced the number of positive cases. This would indicate there was a potential risk from either the water supply or contamination of the outlet itself. And there's two questions that arise from that. One is, following on from that, where, if at all, when do you think that risk ceased?
I think given the building and the number of the incidents that we met to discuss, and given that so much had to be put into the system to remedy and problems came up, I think the reason you have a risk assessment and written scheme is that you can never be complacent, and that you would make sure that your written schemes, your plans were continually looking to make sure that the water supply was safe.
No, I appreciate that, but you've stated that you consider there to have been a risk, and the implication that is one that was then tackled by these treatments, these changes. If there was a risk in the past, when did it stop? Or has it not stopped? Is it still there? Or was it still there when you retired?
There wasn't an incident being discussed when I left, at the point when I left. I can't comment on now. I think you would always, you have alert patients, you have alert organisms that you look out for, and you would continually, risk assessment is an ongoing process. Your written schemes have to be reviewed continually. There's water testing, there's temperature testing. All of that is because you recognise that there could be a problem and you've got legal obligations to make sure.
I appreciate all that, but I think I'm probably not asking the question clearly, so I'll try again. In the answer to this question, I've read you saying that you do consider there to have been a risk of infection from the water supply, because you said yes. You then explained your reasoning a little bit in the next two sentences. What I want to understand is, if you consider there to have been one, when did it stop?
So the water supply and water sampling was positive at certain points for certain organisms, and at the point where the water was no longer positive, I would deem that to be a success in terms of the treatment of that system.
Thank you. Now, the other thing, because I'm conscious that you explained at the beginning that you don't have any training on water safety, was that an unfair question? Should we not have asked you that question? Is that within or without your level of experience?
I think if at an IMC you are told water samples are out with what you would expect, and that you could correlate that with positive patients, then that would be for infection control nurses to consider. Yes, we wouldn't have the technical experience in how to manage that risk from the water supply, but we'd certainly be aware of it.
So you feel that the question of whether there's a risk is determined by whether the samples are out of specification, in a sense?
Yes.
Right. I think I'll come back to that, but what I want to do is just move on a little bit and look at you mentioned briefly in your statement, I don't think I need to go to it. Well, let's go to it. It's the previous page. In C, you remember a group had met with HBS to discuss the choice of taps for the new hospital. Now, Would that have been a meeting in June of 2014 about Horn Optitherm taps? Does this ring a bell?
Yes.
Can we just look briefly at the minute so I make sure on the right page? Bundle 15, page 692. Now, obviously, you're not recorded as being present, so I'm assuming you learnt about it from somebody else.
Yes.
When did you learn about it? Approximately. Soon after or many years later?
I don't know. I can't answer that.
If we go to the next page, it might jog your memory a bit. The one after that, sorry. We have an answer at 5.3 about the South Glasgow Hospital. And it's recorded that it was unanimously agreed that the taps should be installed, and there was no need to imply additional flow control facilities, the last sentence, or remove flow straighteners, and any residual perceived or potential risk would form part of the routine management process. What I'm wondering is, either you might have learned about this before the hospital was built, or you might have learned about it when you're actually helping to run a ward, in a sense, a hospital that's got these taps in it, and you want to know about the taps. And I wonder if that helps you work out when you learned.
So I think I would have had feedback at our weekly meeting about the taps because I would meet with the senior management team.
This probably at the time it happened rather than later.
I would think so.
Right. Well, the question I want to ask then is, Inquiry understands that the hospital had a large number of these Horn Optitherm taps fitted. Do you have those in your, you can imagine that you know
Yes.
what taps I'm talking about? When did you first become aware that they needed some form of regular planned maintenance?
Do you mean before this meeting?
No, ever.
Ever?
I mean, I think it's after the meeting, but I'm intrigued to know when you would have known they need to have regular maintenance.
Yeah. I think all taps would need maintenance one way or the other. I don't think you can just leave a tap. I think you have to make sure that it's serviced. I couldn't.
Well, in that
Speak
case,
to that.
I'll ask the second
But-
question. Sorry, carry on.
But I would imagine that it was after I was given feedback from this meeting about decisions made about the taps.
So we've had some debate amongst witnesses and in documents about when the maintenance of these taps started. So I'm not talking about flushing them, because that seems to have been done by domestic staff, and that's not what I'm talking about.
That's everything.
A process has been described to the inquiry that involves actually physically removing the tap from its mounting and cleaning it in some relatively busy way. And what I suppose I could ask you, because you would have been in and out of that hospital a lot because you were the lead infection control nurse, is when, if ever, did you see people routinely removing and cleaning these taps, as opposed to normal cleaning and flushing?
I don't think I ever observed anyone actually undertaking that, but that might be expected because it's single rooms and you might not see
Well, indeed, you might not
activity in
see
a
it.
single
So
bedroom.
that's not definitive. We'll ask somebody else. Right. Now, while we're talking about taps, we might talk about water testing. Now, obviously, I appreciate that you said earlier on that an infection control nurse doesn't decide how much water testing should be done. But the inquiry's experts have looked at the water testing results they've received from the Health Board. And as they've set out in two of their reports, they've noticed that only 47 water samples were taken in Ward 2A, 2B in 2016, when the year after there's a lot more. And I just wondered if you had noticed any change in the frequency of water testing samples being taken in those early years when you were the lead infection control nurse.
So we wouldn't be informed about when samples were taken and frequency. We might be told by the infection control doctor, by the way, we've done extra water testing because of, but I don't recall any event. So we would be told.
You'd be told. And So you can't explain the differential number yourself?
My fault, Mr. McIntosh. The 47 samples in Ward 2A, that's in 2016.
In 16, yes.
Thank you.
So if you, I don't think you're the right witness to explain that number, so we'll go and ask somebody else.
Okay, thank you.
Now, I want to just pick up something about chill beams. I know we've talked about them already. There's been some evidence, there's some details in your statement about that the beams were dusty on top and appear to drip condensation at times.
Yes.
That's on page 457 of your statement. And that's at the bottom at J. So this is a difficult question to answer, but an easy question to ask, which is, how dusty were they?
They were a level above what you would expect. They were on the ceiling, so therefore they weren't easy access to clean them. But there was a relative level of time.
How often did you need to have them cleaned when you were working in the hospital, or arrange for them to be cleaned, or see they were being cleaned when you were working there, in order to keep them to something like acceptable standard?
So when it was identified, I think they put 6 weekly. It could be more or less than that, but round about 6 weekly, I think it was decided that we would get these cleaned, because that introduced an element of extra work. Who would do that? Because you would have to climb a ladder to get to that work, so there would have to be SOPs written.
And you have to move the patient out of the room.
You would have to you move, but even when the patient not in the room, you would still have to climb up to reach. And I do remember, and it's just come into my head, that facilities were trying to identify a cleaning tool, a microfiber cleaning tool that would reach the top of the chill beam without having to use a ladder.
I see. And in terms of the condensation, how much condensation are we talking about here? Occasional drips or significant quantities?
I don't remember it being overly much. I think there was just drips, and drips that you couldn't, you didn't know when the drips would happen, and the way the chill beams were situated in the ward and the way in the room and the way the bed was, it could drip onto the bed.
It would drip onto the bed, right. Now, what, if any, risks do the dust or condensation from chill beams that you saw pose to patients in those rooms?
So the dust would, the combination of the dust and the condensation and the drips was bringing the dirt from the dust down onto the environment, down onto the patient bed, onto the floor. And at some point, and I don't remember when, the beams were sampled, and there were organisms, environmental organisms there. So that would mean that those organisms in that dust coming down, having a vehicle to come down into the patient area.
Now, these chill beams were in all the rooms in the hospital. We understand. So you may not know this. And was there anything particular about the patients in the Schehallien unit that makes them more or less vulnerable to infection?
Yes, they are classified as a high-risk group, and that's because they have procedures, medications, or their condition will reduce their body's own reaction to infection, protective reaction to infection.
Are there any other wards in the Queen Elizabeth Adult Hospital that would have contained patients who had a reduced immunity
So
in a different or broadly similar way?
In a similar way, yes. You have 4B, when the Beatson BMT unit moved across, that would be when. But any patient who has high-dose steroids, for example, which dampens their immune system, so there could be various patient groups that might be at higher risk of infection.
And would that include patients in 4C?
So I think 4C was haematology.
Yes.
I think. So yes, there might be periods not as extensive as the BMT patients,
No.
because their immune system was actively dampened down. But yes, they could be at risk.
One of the your statement doesn't contain a huge amount of detail about infections before 2018 in the Schehallien unit, but I'm putting that down to the passage of time. I'd like just to look at one particular example and hopefully learn a little bit more about it. And that is the issue in the aseptic pharmacy, which we see in a PAG from the 17th of June, that's bundle 2, page 10 of 2016. So that's 17th of June, 2016. Now, this it's worth taking a moment just to check in what a PAG is, because it's not an IMT, it's something else. What's a PAG?
It's a problem assessment group.
Is it more informal?
It could be more informal. It could have the same general people, but it can be seen as an initial meeting to discuss whether we need an IMT.
And so one of the things that I wanted just to see about this one is it states routine water sampling of the aseptic unit has revealed persistent colonization with Cuprovidus pustulus, a gram-negative environmental organism. Now, was this action taken in respect of the aseptic pharmacy following this PAG?
Yes.
Do you remember? What was that?
So, Dr. Inkster alerted me to the fact that we had a patient with a positive blood culture and samples taken from the aseptic unit that were positive for the same organism. They didn't know if it was the same type. Typing hadn't been undertaken. I asked what she wanted me to do and the team to do. She said the patient has well and gone home, but that could I do? Could I meet with the aseptic unit manager, Joanne, and just do a walk round. She also asked me to look at if I could get the copies of their SOPs, and also if I could find out what water sampling and where the water samples went. I do remember quite a bit about this incident because I was...
You eventually did a presentation at a conference with Dr. Inkster on this, did you?
Yes.
Yes.
Did I?
I should know the answer to this. The aseptic unit, is that within the pharmacy?
It's within a specialist unit, so it's not within the main pharmacy.
Right. But just briefly tell me what it is.
That's fine.
I should know the answer.
The aseptic pharmacy prepares sterile products for intravenous injection.
Right.
So it's at a really high level. It has within it a clean room that has no water and the very, very strict protocols to enter and leave, and very strict protocols in terms of what goes into the clean bit. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
I think I understand that was eventually steps taken to remove a sink in this room.
Yes. I spoke to Joanne, the aseptic manager, and we did a walk round, and I asked her, once she'd shown me her protocols and I'd sent them on to Dr. Inkster, water sampling, regular water sampling, that didn't go to Queen Elizabeth, it went to Stob Hill, I think, lab. It was a quality assurance lab at Stob Hill. I did a walk round and she took me through her processes, how medicines came out of the clean area, the sterile room, and into boxes and prepared in the preparation area. She then took me round the staff area, the staff changing facility. During that time, she told me that the one sink in the unit in the prep area was the one that had been positive, and I identified a sink in the changing room that was deemed a little used outlet because it was never used by staff. It was a tiny sink. for hand hygiene. But the fact was the unit had a shower room and toilet, which had a hand hygiene sink in that, and staff used that. So everyone agreed that that could be removed as a little used outlet. The actual sink as well, Joanne was getting advice from the Stob Hill lab about what to do with the sink, and she was scrubbing the sink with brushes. So we changed how that was done. We stopped the use of the sink immediately, and then Estates came along, and I can't remember if they changed the tap and the sink or both, but certainly the tap was disinfected, and they started Sanozel, I think it's called. It's a disinfection product for the drains, and we had several meetings after that in which I liaised with facilities around the cleaning of that sink, and in terms of the cleaning and the cleaning products that were used in the prep area.
Thank you. So just to recap, this underused sink that was used for hand washing was removed.
Yes.
And the sink that had a positive sample
Yes.
was refitted.
Yes.
Yes, right. I suppose my question is this, is that it sounds to me that at the time you are looking at the place, the aseptic pharmacy. It's the place that's interesting to you, the sinks, not the system, the whole water system that's interesting to you. Would that be a fair comment, fair description of what was going on in your mind at the time?
That's a fair comment.
Right. Now, this is June of 2016. So the hospital's now been open for just over a year. And you at this point, and indeed, as far as we can tell, nobody in the Schiehallion unit or infection control knows that the building water system has been assessed as high risk for Legionella the previous April. And I realize this is a hypothetical and it's a long time ago, but what difference would it have made to you at the time when investigating this particular outbreak, or outbreak's wrong word, this particular incident, if you had known that there were concerns about out of temperature readings or dead legs in the system from the previous year?
It might have been easier to understand why they were getting high results in that sink, and why that sink had the Cupria vadis.
Because we don't actually get that realization until 2018, 2 years later, do we?
Yes.
And so the question is, obviously you left in March 17 and were replaced by Susan Dodd and went back to being a nurse consultant full time. But do you think the fact that the problems that were observed by DMA Canyon were not identified by those involved in managing the hospital at a higher level and the infection control team until 2018 in any way held back your practice as lead infection control nurse? Would you have benefited from knowing what was found out later?
It would help to explain, because with the incidents, we were searching for answers, and where the water supply, what we consider an environmental source, it would have helped to understand what was going on. All that information would have been helpful.
Can I take you back to your statement, to page 444 of the statement bundle? This is question 22. It's about moving on to the water incident. In fact, can we go back to question page 440? I think I've got time for this. Yes, the bottom of this page, you are asked a question which I think is possibly a little bit unfair. Does the extent of the infection observed in the hospital differ from what might have been expected before the hospital opened? Why not? And you've answered that you thought a new building would pose fewer risks of infection the environment from an old building. And then over the page, if we look at the rest of the answer, it just, you wrap it up there, and you observe that in terms of novel or rare organisms, I think they could happen whether it's an old or new building. What I wanted to do was understand, is there a difference from your point of view as an infection control nurse in managing a ward in an old building compared to a new building, or should there be a difference?
I think it's well documented that older healthcare estates can pose, because of fabric of the building, faster deterioration, more difficult to clean that building. I think those all add to the risk where the building was built to previous SHTMs and not yet had a refurbishment to bring it up to current SHTMs, then those buildings could pose a risk.
Because it's just harder to do the job effectively.
It's harder to do the job. The biggest risk is from fabric that deteriorates, where it impacts on cleaning.
So that's walls, ceilings, doors, furniture.
Doors, fabric of the building.
And things grow in that sort of material.
Yes.
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 Well, that's very helpful. What we'll do is we'll jump back to where I meant to go, which is page 444. Question 22. I just want to make sure I've got everybody's jobs organised in my mind.
Just before we leave that point, and Ms. Joannidis, if this is going beyond what you feel able to give an opinion, just say so. What I'm taking from your answer to 16 is that, at least in broad terms, you would have expected the new Queen Elizabeth and Children's Hospital to present, simply by being new, conforming to more recent HTMs and having the benefit of general technological advance, to present fewer environmental risks of infection than an older building such as York Hill.
Yes.
Would it be too much of a simplification to say that you would expect it to perform better? I haven't told you what I mean by perform, but generally have a better experience of environmentally caused infections than an older hospital such as York Hill?
You would hope so, given technological advances, latest research, and where you have the benefit of expertise learned. I think York Hill was built in 1965, I think. So you would very much expect a new building in 2014 to have fewer risk.
Right. So in a sense, it's not really fair to compare York Hill with a newer hospital. That's maybe a bad way of putting it.
I think it would be unfair to suggest that the building York Hill before transfer wasn't maintained. I think that would be unfair to say that or to suggest that. So
the York Hill is a different challenge for the IPC team for the reasons you've explained. But it's not that it wasn't maintained. It's just that it's
Yes.
different and possibly in various ways harder.
I don't want anyone to think that I'm suggesting in any way that York Hill wasn't maintained
No,
to
no.
a very high standard before the transfer of the patients.
But it might have required more work to get there,
Yes,
even though you get to the high standard.
yes.
Right, I understand. I'm going to jump actually and miss out a bit to 458. Bottom up, we've been here before. Remember I asked you a question about the DMA Canning report. Below it, there is a statement, the question 27A, where we put to you a position that one witness, particularly Dr. Peters, has observed that if she had had sight of the DMA Canyon report in 2015, she would not have allowed the hospital to open and you asked if you agree, and you say you're not in a position to answer this. Could I ask you to explain why you're not in a position to answer that?
So I don't know what Dr. Peters, sorry's comments at that time were and what her concerns were, and I don't know what was done when she did raise them, and yeah, I just felt that I wasn't party to that conversation.
Okay, well, maybe I can ask a different question. You're on the water safety group. We've looked at the minutes from August 2015, and we know that there was, or we think, it's better putting it rather we know, we think there wasn't a discussion about the DMA Canyon report then. Everything suggests there wasn't. The hospital opened to some patients in April, and it was handed over in January. What do you think would have happened had the water safety group learned over that winter that the hospital had failed its Legionella risk assessment in terms of the effect on whether it opened on time?
I would expect that once that document was known and that information was known, that there would be a plan to address that.
And presume, would that cause a delay, or would that cause a risk assessment?
I suppose it depends on to what extent the measures that were put in place were effective.
I use it as an example, which you might well be aware of, is that, do you remember we looked at a report, a note which was seemingly sent to you by Dr. Williams, or rather a meeting that you had an action point from Dr. Williams, and we looked at the note, you didn't feel comfortable to comment on it. And at the very bottom it said that notwithstanding these risks, because of the urgency of the transplant, they felt transplants should go ahead. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Right. So am I right in thinking that when one decides to open a facility, there's more to consider than simply whether the water system is compliant?
Yes.
And so are you suggesting that if there was a plan, that plan would have taken account of all the different risks?
Yes, and it would be a multidisciplinary group making that decision, and ultimately including the patient's consultant.
But as far as you're aware, that process didn't happen because people didn't know about it at the time?
I don't know if it happened or not.
You don't know. You don't know. Okay. Well, let's move on to the water, what's commonly known as the water incident. We have a lot of these IMT minutes.
Yes.
And of course, you attended a few in the first few months, I think. Can we go to bundle 1, page 66? Now, this is the 16th of March. Do you remember at the beginning of 2018, well, at the beginning of 2018, you were a nurse consultant.
Yes.
What was the nature of your role then?
So I stopped being the acting lead for the paediatric service, I think, in March 2017. So this was a year on. And as the nurse consultant, I had a number of things in my job plan that I took forward. I also, where necessary, I would sit in on an IMT if either the infection control manager or Sandra Devine couldn't do that. So you can see through these minutes that I might be fired into an IMT, but
well, I do notice that you're sometimes there when they're not.
And I'm sometimes there and I'm not. And you have to take into consideration that the South sector is one sector and there are 5 sectors across the whole of GGC. So there might be an IMT or an incident down in Clyde that I would be sent to. So if there was thought necessary, and also if they thought I might get an action from that IMT, and there's evidence of that when they asked me to go and look at the drains and all the sinks.
Yes.
So that would be when I might be asked to join an IMT.
So I'm therefore not going to ask you about individual IMTs
Yeah.
and what happened to particular ones until we get to the decision to decant. But just in general, at that early part of 2018, I think this might well be the fourth or fifth no, this is the first IMT, sorry. No, it's not the first IMT. Let me get the number right because I think it's probably
this is the
important to
first.
get that to you. It is.
Oh no.
It's the fourth. Now, so in this early part of this process, with what eventually becomes known as the water incident, what's called the water incident here, what then was the primary actions being undertaken by the investigators that you can remember?
So there was, from what I remember, environmental sampling, water sampling. There was consideration of prophylactic treatment for patients, I think. And there were discussions about the safety of the ward.
And
Sorry, discussion about
The safety of the ward in terms of the water.
thank you.
now, what I want to do is to see that you did attend 5 meetings around the time of the decant decision.
Okay.
And I want to look at them in a small amount of detail and then ask you a couple of questions. If we go to page 164, we see that we have a meeting on the 14th September, which is, so you get the context, it's not the meeting before the decision is clear, it's the meeting before that. It's the penultimate meeting before the decision. And what I wanted to ask you is, at this point, I see Tom Walsh there. Are you effectively at this point standing in for Sandra Devine?
No, she's there.
She's there as well. So why are you there?
Again, it might be because they might feel there might be work that I could do. Susie had a lot of work to do around this incident, a lot of actions to take forward. And I would be there in case there was something that they needed me to action. Or if I could lend advice to the process.
So in this sequence, we learn that there is to be a decant ultimately to Ward 6A with the bone marrow transplant patients going to Ward 4B. What was the potential risk that was trying to be avoided by the move?
So I think the positive environmental results and the investigations that had been put in place to that point, they were still identifying cases just before that, I think, and therefore options had to be put as to whether the patients stay in the ward and we can mitigate risk, or if it would be the right thing to move the patients.
And there was, in fact, an options paper produced by Jamie Redfern. Do you remember that?
Yes.
You didn't write it, so I'm not going to take you to it.
And I wasn't at the meeting.
Who actually made the decision to decant the unit?
I don't think I can answer that. I think it would be ultimately those responsible for the patients and that service to make that decision, with all the facts in front of them.
Who would that be in terms of the hierarchy and system of Greater Glasgow Health Board?
So within the children's services, you have a director, and you have the general manager, you have a clinical service manager, and you have a chief nurse. And that group would have spoken to clinicians to help them to make a decision. They would have spoken to infection control teams, they would have spoken to estates, and I think ultimately they would have spoken to the medical director for the board and the chief executive.
Yes, but who made the decision?
I don't know, I can't answer that.
Well, all we can do is look through the minutes, shall we? So if we go on to this particular minute and we jump forward to page 171, do you see at the bottom we have
Yes.
contingency decant? So Kevin Hill, is he the manager?
No, he's the director,
He's the director for the Children's Services.
Children and Women's Services.
Exactly. So I demoted him there, my apologies. And he's reporting back for an executive meeting. And he seems to be reporting that the executive group, which is the fourth line from the bottom, will wait until the drainage expert will give preliminary scope on how they will carry out their work and see what they find. And then Ms. Dodd is reporting anxiety of staff. What was the mood amongst the staff at this point?
So I'm aware from feedback from Susie and also at the IMT. It was either Brenda Gibson or one of the other clinicians present expressed that staff were concerned. So.
Well, let's go to the next page.
Yeah.
We'll see a little bit more. And then Mr. Hill assures the group that the decant option is not off the table. And then there's lots of discussion about how a decant might work in the rest of that minute. And at the bottom of the page, you see the IMT also recommends a decant. Now, we're going to take you on a bit further to the next IMT, which is on page 175. And that you are present there. And then if we go on to page 177, we see we've got there contingency decant, and then the second paragraph, Grant Archibald. Who's Grant Archibald at this point?
I think he was just under the chief executive.
Could he have been chief operating officer?
Yeah, that's it.
And so he says, Grant Archibald informed the group that following a water meeting this morning, it was agreed that BMT patients currently in Ward Tay will be decanted, and describes the decant. So does it look from this minute, and I appreciate there'll be other documents for meetings you weren't at, that the decision was made by some executive water group?
That's what it reads, yes.
Thank you. Now, I'm now going to turn to, we take this up. We'll go to page 258, please, actually. We'll get there quicker. Yes. Possibly I've gone to the wrong page. We go to 255, and we'll start at the start of the minute. So we're now into January of the following year. In your statement, you provide a limited amount of information in respect of Cryptococcus, and in fact can be found on page 448 of your statement, if we look at that as well. Now, do you see in the second paragraph from the top, you discuss a plan to decant patients from Ward 6A to the clinical decision unit and clinical decision units to Ward 2A. I wonder if that could be right, because presumably at that point, wasn't Ward 2A still being rebuilt?
I think Ward 2A works hadn't been started then. I might have this wrong, but I think it hadn't been started and it was an empty ward.
But it wasn't in use.
But it wasn't in use because we had moved the 2A patients, and therefore there was an assessment done that it could be used for front door patients coming through, obviously not oncology.
Right,
patients.
that's what I wanted to be clear. Okay, yeah. that's very helpful to clarify that.
What that is.
Right. We also have on paragraph 29 of your statement, page 460, a discussion of a further decant to the clinical decision unit. And this is at 29, and it's A. And the decision to decant low-risk patients from 6A to CDU. Now, what I want to do is just connect this to some other evidence I've had and see if there's a difference. There may not be. When you say low risk, what do you mean by low risk in this context?
So in the Schahalian patient group, the highest risk patients would be those who were being prepared for stem cell transplant and who would require bone marrow transplant facility, EMT rooms. At the other end, you might have a patient who is coming in for a new central line, but who is out in the community. So that could be the difference between the two types of risk.
So you saw that the people who would be moved to the CDU are those in that second category?
Yes, and that would be determined by the clinicians.
The thing I want to just check is that at this point, which is 2019, this must be after the point you realise that the old Schahalian in 2A outside the BMT rooms is operating at 2.5 to 3 air changes an hour. Have I got that right? Because that would have been when Dr. Inkster arrived. We talked about it.
Yes.
So were you aware of what the air change rate was for all the other wards in the hospital at this point in 2019?
So my understanding was that because of the chilled beams, where we would have expected 6, we were getting 3.
So you knew it was the same everywhere else, as it were?
Yes.
Yes.
I think it was, yes.
Right. Sorry, you gave a figure there. You expected in, I think we're talking about general wards at this point. What did you expect for general wards?
So there'd be a general expectation that it would be 6 air changes.
Yes. Right.
And the information I got back was that due to the presence of a chill beam, for an environmental point of view, it was 3. It's actually 3. So I don't know where it was all 3, but it was 3.
Thank you very much for that. I wonder if we can go back to bundle 1 again. Now there was, I understand, in the late summer of 2019, or early summer, the starting of a gram-negative bacteria IMT. Do you remember those sequence of meetings?
I think so, yes.
You aren't recorded at being a lot of them, so let's take you to the first one I can find you at, which is page 338.
Right, okay.
I think this is the 5th meeting. Now, I want to just understand, firstly, who's here, as it were. Okay. So, in order to keep things simple, we'll go through this list, and if they're a treating clinician, I don't feel a need to read their name out. We'll just work past. It's everybody else I'm interested in.
Right.
So, Dr. Inks is the chair.
Chair.
I'm interested to know whether anybody there is estates or some other role, or whether they're treating physicians. So,
do you want me to go through them?
Yes, the first one.
The ones I know.
Yeah.
Lorraine is press office.
Right.
David McDonald is facilities. I think he was the general manager.
I think. And Professor Steele was head of estates.
He was director of estates.
Yes. Colin Person was at estates.
You know.
Pamela Joannidis is you.
Gillian is the lead nurse for the paediatric infection control service.
So she's taken over from Susan Dodd, effectively.
Yes.
Right.
Annette Rankin.
She's from HPS.
HPS. Kevin Hill.
We met him before. He's the director for the Children and Women's Services.
Yeah. Sandra, you know.
Yes.
Jen Rogers is chief nurse, paediatric service. Scott Davis is associate medical director. Alan Mathers is clinical director for the Women and Children Service. You know Brenda. John Mallon is a lab technical manager in the lab.
Manager lab. Dr. Sastry is a treating physician.
Yeah.
Dermot Murphy is a treating physician. Alan Gallagher is
doing minutes.
And Callum's back again doing minutes. Now, is it fair, and please tell me if it isn't, to notice there's a slight increase in the number of senior people from the hospital management at this IMT?
Yes.
Now, what I want to do is to talk about where we are in this story when you turn up. Because at this point, we're now not quite a year after Decant. We've had the mini Decant to the CDU. There's filters on the taps. There's chlorine dioxide. What are the issues that are causing there to be this IMT?
The issues are around increased cases of gram-negative positive blood cultures.
Now, was there anything unusual about where the environmental samples were being found at this point? I mean, I can put it to you, but I'd be interested to see if you remember. Do you remember they were being found inside the filters?
The point of use filters?
Yes.
You mean they were on the outside?
No, I'll rephrase that. Let's go to the pages. So what we'll do is we'll go to we can go to page 736, which is a senior management team meeting, which might summarize. So bundle 13, sorry, page 736. The reason I'm going to here is I thought it might get us to some information a little bit and work out what's going on. And we'll come back to the IMT minutes in a moment. So this is a meeting of the Infection Prevention Control Senior Management Team, and you're chairing it.
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we go on to page 738, we have a report, and this was a meeting in June of 19, of what's going on. So let's just work through it. We have a Seratia incident still open until program of tap replacement takes place, but that's in NICU.
Yes, that's Seratia and NICU.
Not in 6A. The next section relates to NICU as well. Then we have a PAG that's not, I think, related to this issue. And then another PAG, and then we have PAG reward 6A.
Yeah.
And we have gram-negative bacteremia 3 times HCAI, 2 times HI, monitoring to be continued. Water found to have reduction in gram-negatives. Theatre drains to be found visibly dirty with grime. Sample taken from the drain to have grown Stenotrophomonas and Enterobacter. So do you remember this this detail? Was it ringing a bell now that you read it?
I'm not sure I can.
What I'm interested in is what's the hypothesis at that stage about gram-negative bacteria in the ward?
So you have,
June.
Yeah, you have 5 cases. 3 of them are healthcare associated, which means that they've been in and out of the hospital.
Yeah.
And 2 of them haven't been out in the period, the 48-hour period. And what they're doing here is looking at the patients where they've been. So that's what you would expect to do, and looking at their pathway to determine which areas in the hospital. And clearly, 1 or more of them have been in theatre. And that's what they're doing. They're looking for a link to these. So I can't explain that sentence, water found to have a reduction in gram-negatives. I don't understand that phrase.
Could it be that there was a reduction in the number of gram-negative samples being found?
Yes. I think that's what it is.
Now, the reason I went to this particular page is there's a discussion of a Mycobacterium chelonae case in
Yes.
2019 here. I want to see what knowledge you had of the amount of Mycobacterium chelonae being found in the hospital at this point. So if you can't remember, we can go to different documents. But if you can't remember, that may be where it stops. Do you remember there being a case in 2019 that was in this IMT?
I don't recall that. I do remember meeting, and I don't know if it's the same year, in terms of the adult service raising concerns of an increase. But I can't remember what year that was, sorry.
Well, let's try it a different way. If you can't remember it, we won't be able to do much more. But let's go back to bundle 1, page 338. So we're back to the 8th of August now. And there's some minute changes. And then if we go to this next page, page 339, and there's a discussion going on about water samples. Now, what I'm simply drawing from this one to ask you about is, do you have a recollection of there being discussion in this sequence of IMTs about the chilled beams?
Yes. Not detailed, but
Not
yes.
detailed. Well, that may not matter, but I'm just going to ask you a couple more questions, then wrap it up with a question. Do you have a discussion about gram negatives being found? Do you see the fourth paragraph from the bottom? Might read that before I ask you the question.
Yes.
Do you have a question about a discussion going on about chill beams, about where gram negatives were being found and whether they match the patients and that sort of topic being discussed?
Yes.
Right. And we've gone a bit further over the next page to page 340. You see at the bottom, 3 paragraphs from the bottom, there's a discussion from Kevin Hill about if Ward 4B could give more beds.
Yes.
So was there some discussion about potentially some further decant going on at this point?
For the BMT, 4B is the BMT unit for adults. So there was clearly discussions about if this leads to a bigger, and we do need to decant, what options do we have?
Yeah, and then if we go on to the next page about, which is page 4341, in the middle of the page, do you see a paragraph that starts Tom Steele? Now, this is a very esoteric question, and you might not remember this. Do you remember whether there was a discussion about the coolant in the chill beams being an issue rather than just dust and condensation?
I remember from the minutes that were sent to me this week that there was an expectation that the content inside the chill beam system would be sterile, but that in sampling, that they had identified Pseudomonas there.
So I suppose the question that comes from that, looking back at all these years later, is what was the issue, or what were the issues in this IMT, 8th of August, that we're looking at here, about what needed to be done?
I think by this point they were looking at everything that had caused problems in previous IMTs, so chill beams, drains, water, putting systems in place that we had put in or will continue to be put in place. And we were investigating any potential source for these organisms to explain that increase.
This is a possibly difficult question to answer. To what extent was that a reasonable approach?
I think that's a reasonable approach to ensure that you have a hypothesis for any incident and that you investigate appropriately to either prove or disprove that hypothesis.
Yes.
And in the meantime, you would put control measures in place to reduce that risk based on that hypothesis.
So thank you for that. The question I want to ask you, which you may not remember, is do you have any memory of, you've discussed Mycobacterium chelonae and you said you can't remember something about a year before, so even this may be the edge of your memory. Do you have any memory of there being Mycobacterium chelonae in a patient in the Schiehallion unit, or in the Schiehallion cohort rather, in 2018? Now you would then have been lead, so you might not have known.
I would have been nurse consultant, so I might not have been told that. I might have been, I don't remember.
Dr. Mumford, who's one of the inquiry experts, has noted in her report looking at the BSI infection data that she's obtained from the health board, that in the early part of 2016, there was a patient in the Children's Hospital isolated for Mycobacterium chelonae.
Yes.
At that point, you were lead.
I was the lead, yes.
Do you have any memory about that being something that was noted at the time? We have no PAG or IMT for it.
So I do recall being invited to a meeting with Professor Williams and the paediatric CF team, where they were discussing patients, and they asked if the infection control nurses could identify where that patient had been.
So this is in 2016?
I think it was 2016.
And it's Mycobacterium chelonae?
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. Sorry, it wasn't.
No, right. Well, that will sort of unwind that. So going back to Mycobacterium chelonae, that's the question I'm asking about.
Sorry, no,
in
it
the
wasn't.
early part of 16, do you have any memory of that?
No, I don't.
No, you don't. Okay. I want to move past the meeting of the 14th of August because you weren't there.
Right.
So you missed the meeting. And move on to the next meeting, which is the 23rd of September. Now, this is on page 348. Now, before we discuss that, I want to ask you whether you have any experience of there being pre-meetings before IMTs.
No.
When you arrived at this meeting on the 23rd of August at 10 o'clock in the morning, did you arrive early, or did you arrive on time, or did you arrive late? And were you aware of there being a pre-meeting?
I don't know.
You don't remember, or you?
I don't remember.
Because it's been suggested that some of the people who attended the IMT, but not all of them, were in a pre-meeting before the meeting started in the same room, and that various people, including Dr. Inkster and Annette Rankin, had to wait outside while the pre-meeting concluded. Do you have any knowledge about this?
It doesn't ring a bell, but if you're asking me, was this the first meeting that Dr. Crichton was going to chair?
It was the first meeting Dr. Crichton chaired, yes.
Could that have been that there was a pre-meeting?
Well, I don't want to speculate. So
to update Dr. Crichton, because she was now chairing the meeting?
Possibly. Were you in the pre-meeting?
No.
No, so we'll better ask someone who was
I
there.
don't know.
So what I'm wondering is, do you remember the start of the meeting? This meeting?
Yes.
Do you remember anyone drawing attention to the fact that Dr. Crichton was now in the chair?
What do you mean by drawing attention?
Well, asking why is Dr. Crichton in the chair, or Dr. Crichton explaining why she was in the chair. Was there a discussion about who's in the chair at the beginning of the meeting?
I don't remember a discussion about why Dr. Crichton had taken over. There were introductions made.
Do you remember Dr. Inkster raising the question of why she wasn't the chair?
I don't remember.
What was the tone of the meeting?
It's hard to describe, I think.
I'm afraid to have to press you
Yes.
to use some words.
I think the meeting was business-like. Once introductions had been made, we got down to the agenda. Yeah, I would say it was a formal meeting.
Before you arrived at the meeting, did you know that Dr. Crichton was to take over?
No.
I mean, I'm not going to ask you, was it a surprise to you, because that tells you the answer. How did you respond emotionally to that?
I was aware of Dr. Crichton. We had previously done some work around pandemic influenza, just by telephone conversation, in a sort of emergency situation. So I was pleased to see her as a person, and she just cracked on. She was very businesslike.
Is it usual to replace the chairs of IMTs and infection control IMTs in wards?
I would say no. It was normally have the same person for consistency, unless the person who was chairing couldn't make that meeting for whatever reason, but it was felt the meeting had to carry on.
But in this case, the person chairing was at the meeting. So were you ever told why the chair changed?
It wasn't explained to me why the chair changed. I wasn't given a formal reason for that.
It's been suggested in other people's statements that some people expressed surprise at the change, and particularly Ms. Rankin and Dr. Inkster, and it's been suggested in Dr. Crichton's statement that there was something of a pushback. There was a distinct tone to the meeting when this was discussed. Now, obviously, haven't given evidence yet, so we'll have to ask them for their version of it. But did you detect any of that when you were there?
It might have been me, but I thought it was unusual that Dr. Inkster was in the room and wasn't the chair. But I didn't know whether there were personal reasons, or if something had happened.
Because we have evidence already from Professor Gibson about what happened, and she's not describing a workaday formal meeting where nothing's mentioned. She describes discussion about this.
Right.
Do you not remember?
I don't remember, no.
Before this meeting, you'd been at one meeting, I think possibly two meetings. Were you at meetings of this IMT afterwards?
Yes.
Was there any change of approach to the IMT after there was a change of chair?
I do remember that Craig White from the Scottish Government became a member, I think, of this IMT. He wasn't there at this time.
What I was more thinking about, rather than the question of communications, was there any change of approach to the question of infection and prevention and control, and how it's investigated between before the change of chair and after the change of chair?
I can't remember. I'm not sure I know how to answer that.
What's been suggested is that before the change of chair, the meeting was, as you described, a series of discussions about lots of different options.
Yes.
That we've been through: chill beams, water, drains, possible decant. And after the meeting, it's been suggested that there were Well, what was the meeting? What was the hypothesis after the meeting? After the change of chair? In the subsequent meetings?
I can't remember the hypothesis changing, but I do know that I was asked to look at the root cause analysis for each patient
Yes.
to see if we could determine anything more from this patient group.
What root cause analysis? Could you explain what you mean by that?
So I was asked to do a root cause analysis. I didn't have experience in that previously, but it was decided that we would use a pro forma that was provided by HPS for the NICU Seracia incident, and we'd use that to collect data. From that, I would summarise any trends from any of the patient groups to try and identify if there were common themes. So a root cause for the infections. So we looked at individual patients and their journey prior to them having a positive blood
So you
culture.
looked at events that had happened to them,
Yes.
places they'd
Were
been.
they in surgery? Were they at home? Where were they staying? What procedures did they have done in and around the positive blood culture?
But this is the first time you'd done a root cause analysis.
Oh, yes.
Right. Are you aware of whether that became a practice in subsequent IMTs of doing root cause analysis?
So one of the decisions from this IMT, I think it was that would happen for every patient going forward.
So that's a new thing in a sense.
It was a new thing, and I think we also used it for PICU patients. I can't be sure, but I think it was something that was certainly recommended in the oversight board recommendations, I think.
Well, we're going to come back to those in a moment.
Okay.
But before we do that, I have two hypotheses to put to you. They're slightly long, but I want to see how you react to both of them. So the first suggestion is this, is that before the change of chair, there was an unreasonable interest in drains and chill beams, and that the fitting of point-of-use filters and the chlorine dioxide had removed the main or principal risk to patients, and the pattern of infection was simply comparable to the old hospital. What do you think of that as a sort of...
Can I just make sure that I've got that?
Yes,
First
so that
hypothesis
was that
before the change of
chair, there was an unreasonable interest in drains and chilled beams, that the fitting, and that in fact the fitting of the point-of-use filters and the chlorine dioxide system had removed the main or principal risk to patients, and that in any event, patterns of infection were comparable to the old hospital. Now, that some people have expressed that sort of view of what was going on before the change of chair. How do you respond to that as a sort of view of what was going on?
I don't think it was unreasonable to continue to include those hypotheses with regard to drains, water, chill beams, taps. I think that was reasonable. I can't comment on, I don't feel I can comment on whether I feel the attention to those was what you described as
Unreasonable.
unreasonable. I think you would expect that it was included in any hypothesis for an IMT, given the history.
So the alternative position...
Can I just be clear that
Yes.
I've got the witnesses' response? First of all, the short answer, as it were, what I think I took from your answer was that you did not think it unreasonable to consider drains, children units as a possible source of
Gram-negative organisms.
And that was in a context where at the IMTs, it was generally accepted there had been a degree of exceedance of gram-negative infections. Is that fair or not fair?
That was the reason we were having the IMT. Yes.
Right.
So the second position is sort of takes an opposite perspective and suggests that after the change of chair, there was a change towards removing chill beams from the hypothesis and working on the basis that what was being seen was a normal background rate of infections, particularly for gram-negative infections. What do you think of that view?
I'm aware of the reports that suggested that it was a normal background. However, we had history of incidents in the ward with this group of patients, and you would want to include previous sources in any hypothesis for a new incident. You wouldn't necessarily just focus on those. And I think that's why I was brought in to do the root cause analysis, to understand if there were any other factors. So to include, and that on the back of cleaning chill beams, there being a system in place to reduce the risk from
Yes.
the chill beams once it had been recognised, drain cleaning and point of use filters. So with that in mind, and having not confidence, that's the wrong word, but knowing that you have these systems in place and that those systems are actually taking place, you might want to broaden your hypothesis because it might be something new. And as an IMT, you would want to consider that.
Okay. Now,
Again, I'm sorry, Mr. McIntosh.
no, of course.
Your second hypothesis included the proposition that the consent, or tell me if I'm wrong, the consensus in the IMTs was there was not, in fact.
No, I didn't mention a consensus. I was just saying there was a change towards removing chill beams as a hypothesis and a move to accept what was being seen as part of the normal background rate of infections.
Right. Well, you may have to educate me because I'm seeing that as a change from proceeding on the basis that there's an exceedance which we're trying to investigate to a situation where not only we're no longer interested in chill beams, but in fact, there is not an exceedance.
Indeed, that's the question I'm putting to the witness. It's those two things combined is that alternative hypothesis that after the change of chair, not only do chill beams receive less emphasis or they are removed from the hypothesis, that at the same time, and it perhaps tied into it, there's a view that what is happening is part of a normal background rate of infections. And I think you've answered the chill beams bit of that,
Okay.
but I don't think you've answered whether there was either an acceptance or a recognition, I'm not sure what the right word is, of the idea that this was a normal background rate of infections in the subsequent IMTs. If you can't answer, that's fine too, but I'm interested to get your views.
I don't think there was a general acceptance that this is normal, we can close down this IMT. I think there was an acceptance that we've done what we can and we're continuing to do, put measures in place for the chill beams and for the drains and for the water. But let's look wider. I think there is a background to that patient group, and that's my experience over many years as a paediatric nurse. I think there is a background, but I also think we had incidents of higher rates, just clusters, if you like, that had to be considered.
Right.
That-
I think it's quite quite clear what your answer means. But can I just absolutely make sure that I'm following it?
Yeah.
When you say, yes, there is a background, what I'm understanding from that answer is that one would expect a certain level of infections in this particular patient population because of their vulnerabilities. But both before and after the change of chair, there was at least a concern that the experience was of a rate of infection which was higher than what you might anticipate by reason of what you've described as background. Have I got that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
That's your understanding.
Thank you. I only have one more question before I move on to the Oversight Board reports and things, which is, this is now August 19, and what we don't know, of course, is we're 4 months from the start of the pandemic. And I think it's probably important that this inquiry understands how the pandemic affected the Children's Hospital in simple numbers terms and the nature of infection control. So just in numbers terms, we can get actual numbers from the health board, but in terms of the way the hospital is being run, are the number of patients dropping off, or is it staying the same as the pandemic starts in February, March 2020?
Do you mean number of patients?
In the Children's Hospital?
In the Children's Hospital.
Over the
with
next
COVID?
year, due to COVID, yes.
Oh,
Does it get emptier, is what I'm trying to wonder, or does it stay the same? Does it get more full?
they were busy because they're always busy. They didn't see as many COVID, is my understanding, and that COVID didn't impact on children the way it did in adults.
Right.
But winter, RSV, the hospital would always have a higher incidence of patients in the winter months, and I'm not aware that that changed significantly.
Right.
But I might be wrong in that.
The other one is a bit more difficult, and it may not be possible to answer it. From the point of view of an infection prevention control team, and I'm talking about the Children's Hospital here, I'm not talking about adult hospital. Did the challenges of running an infection prevention control team in the hospital, when you talk to your lead nurse, did those change in any particular way during the COVID pandemic beyond the need to tackle COVID as a risk? Did the number of people in the wards reduce, for example?
I don't think I have the information to answer that.
Okay. My final question is to turn to the Oversight Board case notes review. Now, in your statement, we asked you, well, before we do that, is Dr. Inkster has explained in her statement that before she spoke to the independent review, you gave her a folder of documents and encouraged her to read it before she spoke to the review. Is that correct?
Does she mean the folder with the plans for the hospital that had accumulated in the office?
I think they contained emails, a lot of emails.
I'm not sure about that. It was a folder of.
But was it a folder you gave to her before the independent review?
I think it probably was.
Right. Okay. Well, that's probably enough for me then. Right now, in your report, we asked you, in your statement, we asked you if we could go to your statement, please. At page 462, we asked you, perhaps foolishly, at 34, what recommendations for improvements came out of these reviews, and you appear to have cut and pasted in the reviews recommendations. I think the question we meant to ask you, we probably should have asked you, was this: is that before you retired in March 22, so that's a year after the case notes review is published, the Oversight Board report is published. In that year, your final year, was there a process running to implement the recommendations of these three reviews?
That's my understanding, yes.
Were you involved in that process in any way?
I don't recall being involved. I was involved in the water technical groups at some point, the different water technical group. I may have been as I stepped in and out, but I don't.
Are you aware of there being a working group or something set up?
Yes.
And what was that called?
Is there an oversight or?
Could it have been called the ARG? that ring a bell?
No.
No.
Doesn't ring a bell,
Okay.
sorry.
But you weren't involved.
I don't remember being involved. I think Angela Wallace
We'll ask Angela Wallace.
was in the board at that point. Sorry, I can't remember.
No. So the final thing I want to press you on is on question 35 of your statement, which is after all these bits we forced you to put in, which is on page 470. You discuss the top half of the page. We ask you about staffing levels. And within the answer, 5 lines at the bottom of the answer, you say, I do recall when all the consultant microbiologists with infection control sessions at the hospital resigned at the same time, this did cause a gap in the service immediately. When was this?
I don't recall the date.
Well, let's break it down by your
do
career.
remember the
Was it
date, though.
before you stopped being the lead IPC
Yeah, no,
in March 17 or just after that?
I wasn't. I don't think I was a lead IPC. I don't think so. I can't remember.
Did anyone ever explain to you why these doctors resigned their sessions?
I was made aware after that there were concerns about the safety of patients in the Queen Elizabeth.
But you weren't involved in their resignation?
In
They didn't discuss it with you in advance or anything like that?
No.
No. In terms of the working relationship between infection control nurses and microbiologists over broadly the last decade, it's been suggested that at times after 2011, at times there was difficult working relationships between microbiologists and some of the infection control nurses, and there was a sort of slight separation of approach going on. Does that ring a bell with you? Or anything you got to comment about that?
I can't comment on individual relationships between people. I think infection control nurses carry on with the day-to-day work, and they are full-time employed to undertake the roles of an infection control nurse within the team. Sorry, what was your question?
The question was, were you aware of any sort of slight tension between microbiologists on one side and infection control nurses, senior nurses, in the period post-2011? About who's in charge and who makes decisions and things like that?
I think there was comments made that compared to other infection control teams that in GGC the nurses seemed to get on with the day-to-day and make their own decisions, and they were managed by the associate nurse director. Where others, I think, felt that the infection control doctor should be in charge of the nurses.
Because there's this whole concept of what is a nurse-led service in the health service. Is infection control a nurse-led service? And if it is, what would you mean by that?
I don't think it is a nurse-led service. We have an infection control manager who is not necessarily a nurse.
And indeed may not even be a doctor either.
Or a doctor. Could be a healthcare scientist. It could be a clinical person, but it doesn't necessarily have to have the appropriate experience and qualifications to be a manager.
Because it's also been suggested, in fact, by one of the inquiry's experts that there would be merit in there being clearly a lead infection control clinician with experience, either a doctor or a nurse, for each hospital, rather than for different parts of a hospital or different sectors of a large health board. And it seems very obvious in what we've been investigating that there was no infection control doctor or indeed nurse solely responsible for every aspect of what happened on the Queen Elizabeth site. It was part of a sector, or it was part of a particular service, like your children's service. How would you comment to that suggestion that it would have been better if there had been a lead infection control doctor and a lead infection control nurse just for the hospital?
So there was an infection control doctor and a lead infection control nurse for each sector, and the south sector was the Queen Elizabeth.
Did it have anything else in it at the time?
I think by that time the Victoria Infirmary had moved across and closed. So the Victoria Infirmary, Mearnskirk had closed, Mansion House had closed. So I don't think there were any other. I think.
So you think it was effectively a lead for the site in reality?
So I think there was an infection control doctor for their site.
Yeah.
We had a term called lead infection control doctor who sat with the senior management team because there were 5 infection control teams across Glasgow.
So the lead covered the whole of the health board area?
Yes.
And so that in sequence, who was the lead for the sector when you were lead for the Children's Hospital?
So before I came, it was Professor Williams, who was the lead infection control doctor for the board.
The board.
And the infection control doctor for the paediatric women and children service. And then Dr. Inkster took over as the lead for the board and the lead for the paediatric service.
Right. And then who succeeded her as lead for the
Linda
for the board?
McBrady.
And then who succeeded Professor Williams as lead for the paediatrics?
Dr. Inkster.
And who succeeded Dr. Inkster as lead for paediatrics?
I think it's, and you're talking about now.
Well, no, just before you retired, because remember.
So I think it was a combination of Dr. McGrady and Pepe Valraki, I think.
So the final question, I suppose, before we have a break to see if my colleagues have any questions I haven't asked, is looking back on this, obviously you're now retired, and focusing on management structures as opposed to day-to-day decisions. Is there any way you would see that the management of this hospital and these units that we've been talking about in terms of infection prevention control could have been done better in that, what is it now, nearly 10 years since it was about to open?
Do you mean anything specifically?
Yes, anything you've got in mind, because this is a public inquiry, we make recommendations, anything you think should be done better?
So I think it was necessary to have a senior management team because the board is very large. And as I said, has 5 sectors covering regional services. And it is, I think, 1/3 of NHS in Scotland, the board. So that structure, I think, was important. I think that because it was a single health board, it was important that each of the 5 sectors had the same approach to infection control. Given that some of the hospitals didn't have the more at-risk patient groups, notwithstanding, I think it was important that we had a governance route for all reporting of infection control up through the senior infection control team, up to governance routes, up to the board. So I think that's really important, and I also think it's important that systems and processes are replicated in the ways of reporting, governance, and the ways that the infection control nurses worked.
That's helpful, but is there anything you would change?
Is there anything? I think, in terms of the hospital, to have for the lifetime of the hospital plan to hand over, having an infection control team dedicated to that, I think that would be important.
So there should have been an infection control team dedicated to handover?
Throughout. I think it's understandable that there were periods when the hospital was under construction where an infection control team wouldn't be used. But I still think it's important for continuity, and that would be something I think.
So the idea is you'd set up the infection control team before you build the hospital. You keep them in place. You have them there. They grow once it opens, but it's the same people who take it through the journey.
Before planning, yes, and all the way through.
Okay, now, I think, my lord, I think I've asked the questions I planned to ask, but I wonder if we might have our traditional 10-minute break so I can see if any of my colleagues want to ask any more.
Yes, we'll do that. Just on that last point, Ms. Joannidis, you were asked if you had any recommendations, and your final recommendation, or your recommendation, was to have a dedicated infection prevention and control team before construction,
At planning.
perhaps during
Inception, at the idea we're going to build a new hospital.
right at the very beginning of the project. Same team remains in place until completion of handover.
Completion to the satisfaction of
Right.
everyone, yes.
I suppose the question that follows from that is, did that happen? Because you were involved at various points. We went through the emails.
So I wasn't on the project team, but I was asked to attend, as I said in my statement.
Yes. And you were at various points, you're involved in meetings.
And then Annette Rankin was involved because she became the nurse consultant in GGC. And then we appointed Jackie Barman-Roy as the nurse consultant on the project full-time.
Yes.
Who became part of the project team. And then.
But there wasn't a single team. There was this Professor Williams, who was the lead ICD, and the nursing team you've just described. But there wasn't a single team combining nurses and doctors together.
I think that might not be necessary for a small build.
Yes.
But this was like a small city. It was huge.
It is. Well, thank you very much. I think we're going to probably break for a moment, and what we have to do is wait for agents who might have people viewing this remotely, and we'll take a few minutes to just see what's going on.
Right. We'll do precisely as Ms. McIntosh suggests, but again, just for my notes, did you say Jackie Stewart became the
Barman-Roy? Yes.
Stuart Barman-Roy. It was just whether
it was Jackie Barmer-Roy, my lord.
She was Stewart and
Jackie Stewart, then Jackie Barmer-Roy. It's the same person.
Thank you. If I could ask you to go back to the witness room, we might take about 10 minutes.
Thank you.
I'm pleased to report I have no questions that my colleagues in the room would like me to ask.
Well, we'll ask Ms. Joannidis to join us. Thank you, Ms. Joannidis. I understand there's no further questions, therefore you're free to go. But before you do go, can I say thank you both for your attendance here today, giving evidence, but also for the work that went into preparing for that evidence, preparing your witness statement and considering documents. I'm very grateful for that. Thank you, but you're now free to go.
Thank you.
My lord, the next witness will be on Tuesday. It will be Annette Rankin.
In that case, can I wish you a good weekend? We will hope to see each other on Tuesday.